This is a lecture on Allen Ginsberg's poem called Howl, and you're looking at an image of Allen Ginsberg as a young man in the late 40s, early 1950s. The objectives for this brief lecture are the Beat Generation, a brief biography of Allen Ginsberg, the poem, a few technical aspects, mostly in part one of the poem, and of course, consideration of tempo. So this is taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it just goes over the Beat Generation. And of course, you can read it. The Beat Generation began post-World War II and kind of as a response to it, so that the Beat Generation was quite, they felt individuals that felt very stifled in the 40s and the 50s of the United States of America, and the conformity that was so prevalent at that time period. They initially began in 3 cities in the United States: San Francisco, New York City, and Los Angeles. And then as it kind of took root, it spread out. They are stereotypically, there's that idea that they're always in black, they're wearing French little berets, they're snapping their fingers at poetry readings. That's a very stereotypical kind of image of them. They were, I guess, kind of like the first hipsters, and you'll see that word prop up if you continue to read their writing past Howl. They were bohemians and artists that believed in free expression and that wanted to discard kind of classism and racism and kind of embrace people in all walks of life. And of course, they're involved in a lot of promiscuous sex, drugs, part of the jazz music scene. And in some cases, a lot of them were quite interested in Zen Buddhism, particularly like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg to some degree, Neil Cassady, Carolyn Cassady. So there's also like these kind of religious tones to a lot of what they're doing. And of course, they wanted to transform not only poetry, but literature. Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road broke down so many boundaries and barriers with the novel and its form. And it's quite similar to Howl in that it moves in a similar way, a lot of run-on sentences, a lot of alliteration. The book itself is kind of like a very long prose poem, relying on a lot of poetic devices. Allen Ginsberg's Howl, it became the representation of kind of like the beat literary movement. Also, when the book Howl and Other Poems was published by City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco by the owner Ferlinghetti, he was charged with, I think it was obscenity in the San Francisco court system. So it also, there were a lot of critics that responded to kind of this obscenity, this open reference to heterosexual and homosexual sex and all of that. They really well, they were taken to court for that kind of language. This is an image of some of the most famous of the beat writers. Neil Cassady is the second, moving from the left, and he was a muse in a lot of ways. He wrote some, but not much. He wasn't very well published, but he's the main character of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and was a main character in many of the pieces written by the writers in that literary movement. At the far end, is Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and he was taken to court. And they're outside of Ferlinghetti's bookstore in San Francisco, City Lights bookstore, which is still there, I believe. And here are just some more images of the Beat Generation. These first two on this side here, these are famous, like you may already be recognizing, like Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg. This image here is just beatniks involved in the movement at a poetry reading. This is a really brief biography of Allen Ginsberg. It's from the Poetry Foundation. He was born in 1926 in New Jersey. His mother was a Russian expatriate. His father was an English teacher. His early life was quite marked by his mother's psychological problems. She had a series of nervous breakdowns. He also, you'll notice Howl is directed to Carl Solomon, and this was also a very good friend of Allen Ginsberg, who was also in a mental institution. Ginsberg himself, he was became kind of embroiled in some illegal activity and was keeping stolen goods in his apartment in New York City. This was while he was attending Columbia University, and rather than go to prison, he claimed he was insane, and he spent 8 months in a mental institution. So there's a lot of, he's an advocate for mental health. He really, much of his work looks upon mental illness and suicide tendencies, those kinds of things that we often associate with mental illness. He was diagnosed with liver cancer in 1997. He was already quite ill. He had diabetes, and I believe he had heart problems, but I'm not exactly sure. I know after he was diagnosed, he wrote, I think it was 12 poems, and then suffered a stroke and passed away 2 days later. He once explained that among human faults, and I love this quote of his, he was most tolerant of anger in his friends. He liked articulating feelings in company. He was a bridge between the literary avant-garde and pop culture. So and he often acted as that bridge between kind of highbrow literary, especially later on in his life when he was kind of granted the mantle of having changed the face of poetry. So Howl is, as you are probably well aware, a very long-lined poem. It was influenced by Allen Ginsberg's reading of Walt Whitman, influenced by William Blake, Emerson, and also the Bible. Many critics say that it is an outcry of rage and despair against a destructive, abusive society. Kevin O'Sullivan, writing in the magazine Newsmakers, deemed Howl an angry, sexually explicit poem and added that it is considered by many to be a revolutionary event in American poetry. So at the time it was published, it was considered very raw, the language, that everyday use of what kind of like that stream of consciousness language was very unknown at that point. And this poem wasn't well received by what was considered traditional critics. When Ferlinghetti was sued, or charged, not sued, but charged with publishing a graphic sexual language, and they called the book obscene, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti was arrested. That trial attracted national attention, and many prominent literary figures were called upon by Ferlinghetti's defense to address Howl. Mark Shore testified that Ginsberg uses the rhythms of ordinary speech and also the diction of ordinary speech. I would say the poem uses necessarily the language of vulgarity. So he was saying that it was not obscene, but that so-called vulgar language was necessary to the poem. A few technical aspects, and I'm going to look at part one in a moment. Um, there's just an abundance of people, places, food, music, sex, drugs, madness, suicides, and sometimes just made up words. We know what he's saying, but they're not technically sound. The first person perspective, of course, is clear from the very first line, and the very first word is I. Sometimes the syntax is quite unusual. Sometimes the language is it almost argues against itself. In part one, there is, especially in part one, I noticed that repetition of who. These long lines slow the reading down because they demand that you have to breathe, and the long lines are not helping you. So it can be difficult to read it out loud. And of course, it contains many, many different rhythms and tones. So this is just a piece of that first section. I didn't do the entire first section, but I did a piece of it. And I've highlighted some of those things that are standing out to me as I'm looking at it, but not all of them. Of course, saw, best, minds, destroyed, madness, starving, hysterical, themselves, streets. So definitely S's. S's are fairly easy, though, of course, in the English language, we have many words that begin with S and contain the letter S. Also like that repetition of R, internal rhymes with through and row, um, right here, and row. Um, there's some work with like generation, and that kind of connection, machinery, um, some work along that. Rhyme with hollow-eyed, right here. Hollow-eyed, and of course high. Uh, Endings, ing endings, ed endings, lots of work with R. It's just an incredibly language rich poem. So of course, these are fairly easy to find. And think, honestly, what really stands out is that repetition of who. And almost the way it kind of works as an incantation. Um, we see right from that very first I saw, and this is actually the opening is quite a famous line. I saw the best minds of my generation. And these are the first line is well known. And it starts, of course, with that first person, the speaker's experience. And right away, we were taken into as he looks back and around him at those suffering, kind of in those rigid confines of conformity in that post war America. And then it kind of moves to they're on the streets looking for drugs, almost so it seems as a sort of self-medication. And then, of course, we come to that beautiful repetition of who. Beats loved the jazz musicians Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And so there's a lot of comment upon the tempo, which we will get to soon, but that tempo mimicking the bebop sound of jazz at that time. The sound is almost like texture. It's so evocative and rich in this piece. There is a reference to L here, who bared their brains to heaven under the L. That's referring to a subway system in New York City that is elevated, so it's actually not underground, but it's up. And Paradise Alley refers to a neighborhood in New York City where many writers and artists lived. So I think that that might clear up some of that. Most critics say that the poem is a social commentary from the margins of society. Remember that Allen Ginsberg is Jewish, homosexual. His mother's a Russian expatriate, and he's living in Cold War America after the Second World War. And I think it's very clear he aligns himself with poets, artists, radicals, homosexuals, and the mentally ill. The themes are so many and so varied: madness, mental illness, sexuality, drug culture, politics, religion, war, freedom of speech, capitalism, which he is against, creative inspiration, and also hope. Hope for his own generation to be able to kind of dismantle these rigid confines of relationships and sexuality and capitalism. I think it's really important because Allen Ginsberg is so good at this. He doesn't tell, he shows. And telling is to kind of prescribe in that it closes meanings and it can often lack originality and it flattens, I think, just by its assumption in writing. Whereas showing is very, it gives birth in a way. It creates conditions for new thoughts and associations. It's often original and it allows readers to experience complexity. So, for example, telling is if I just state in a declarative sentence, my mom is optimistic. I'm telling you that she is optimistic. I'm in no way showing that. I'm not offering any kind of proof or evidence. I am telling you. To show you, it might be something like my mom gathers literature from Alcoholics Anonymous with the hope that one day she will present it to my sister. So you're seeing my mother's optimism in that action, and it's also giving you a lot more information. The image is of Lawrence Ferlinghetti at a poetry reading, and beat the beat poets liked using jazz musicians to back them up while they read their work. I want to close by really considering tempo. And so we've got kind of, I think, in some ways, these two things that are arguing. Alliteration, assonance, the surreal imagery, and the event of wordplay, which kind of, to me, almost speeds the poem up alongside these really long line lengths and a kind of staccato, stressed jazz kind of beat beneath it. So the tempo can be quite difficult because in some ways you have these kind of two things fighting against one another and yet working beautifully together. And this is the lecture on Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and I hope that you appreciate and enjoy this poem as much as I do. I look forward to reading your poems that are going to be inspired or are going to offer kind of another way of using this tempo of Howl. And all the best to you. Have a lovely week.